It's the first casual Friday of Finish It February. Now, I don't know if there's going to be a need for any direct links down in the description, but if there are some obvious sections to this video, then I will put links down there like I do on Technique Tuesdays. So this is the first installment of Finish It February, where I show you what I finished so far. I've only got a couple of things because it's very early in the month, but first I wanted to give a few updates about my total number of UFOs versus things I'm going to frog, and answer the question about the what is this, one of the bags that I had found last week. So there was a bag, a project bag that I found up on a shelf, right, with all my stash yarn. And I wasn't sure what it was. It looked like a sort of a half-finished sweater that I had abandoned mid-design. I really didn't know what it was, and I wasn't sure why it was up there rather than in the bins with the other unfinished projects. So when I dumped it out, first thing I saw was there was like the bottom half of a body, and there was no other yarn in it, in the bag with it, and I didn't have that yarn on my shelves. And then I realized, oh, I used all of the other yarn to make a completely different sweater. It was the sweater I was wearing on Tuesday when I was demonstrating how to sew buttons onto a button band. So that answered that mystery. So the reason that that bag was up with my stash yarn was because I had returned it to stash yarn. So now I know, okay, the next time you do that, put a little note in there that says this is not an unfinished object, this is available yarn or something, so that I'll know why I did that. So that was the first thing. The second thing was when I was counting up the number of things that I was, I'm not going to finish this ever. I was at 6 near the end, and then I found one more, but instead of upping the count to 7, for some reason, I switched it down to 5. So there were 7 things that I'm not going to complete at all. And then there were 14 things that were UFOs that I was going to do a more thorough assessment and kind of figure out what the plan was for this month. Now, when I was looking at the video and I was going through all of my things to take photographs, I found another item in the pile, and that item was, let's see, there's one. This is like samples that I make, designs that I have, that a lot of them, well, some of them are things where the design is out there in the world, but some aren't. So it was this pair of fingerless mitts where I had this kind of knot thing at the wrist, like this kind of, where is it? It's over here, this little knot. And I had 2 different versions, one where the cable it was running up came up from that loop, and the other was where it was opposite of that. And I was trying to decide which one I liked. And I'm still not sure what I'm going to do with this, but I don't consider this a UFO. I consider this a design that has not been fully figured out yet. So it's going in here. It does not count as a UFO, but you might have seen it on the floor underneath the pile of other things, and that's what it is. So that was 14 things. Then I realized that in the room next to me where I filmed the overhead video stuff, I had a pair of mittens that I was using for a video a few months ago, where it's showing how to line mittens with fleece. And so I had 3 different types of mittens, and this was the one where you have the thumb gusset on the palm. So I had made the lining for one of them. I never did sew it in yet. It's in here, but it hasn't been sewn in. But I didn't do the lining for the second one. So this is another project that I need to finish. That makes 15. And then in January, I was working on a sample, like my first pattern that I released. It's a reversibly cabled scarf. I need to update it, just kind of change it. And I needed to do a new sample for it. So that's what the sample is, but I haven't woven in the ends. I haven't washed it. So I need to do that. So that makes 16. And then, oh, when I was showing you around my office, I have a little stackable drawer thing that had my notions in it. And the top drawer of the notions, I had said, well, this is a lot of stuff I don't use very often. But I also have buttons in there. So the buttons that I have in there are for buttons for 2 sweaters that are in my UFO pile that I do want to finish. And then there's a set of buttons that it's sort of like stash yarn where, oh, this is so pretty. And then I don't know what to do with them. So, but then I picked up a set of buttons in a little plastic envelope that I was holding in my hand in that video. And I said, oh, and I have buttons, you know, that I need to replace on existing cardigans, and threw it back in there. And I realized that should be a UFO. I should, because it's a cardigan it's this cardigan. I finished it, you know, 1990 or something. And one of the buttons had fallen off. I hated the buttons. I don't know if they came with the kit. This was a kit because there was no way I could pick out colors to go with it. But I'd lost one of the buttons. So about 2 years ago, I was starting to wear the sweater again. It was in my cupboard for a long time. And so either I've gotten so old I don't care what I'm wearing, or it's coming back into fashion more. I'm not really sure why, but plus it's warm and it fits and whatever. So I took it into the shop and I needed some help. The manager gave me some help because she picked up buttons that go really well with it, but I would not have been able to do that. So I put new buttons on my cardigan. And so that makes 17 projects. So this brings it back down to 16 because I did the buttons. And then I did finished two pairs of socks. And so they're still really wet. I just took them out of the wash. They haven't been hung up to dry yet. But the first pair is a pair for Sasquatch, my brother. He has very big feet. And I made this with a 6-ply Regia sock yarn. I like to use 6-ply yarn for him because then it takes the same amount of time to knit a pair of socks for him as it takes to knit a pair of socks for me if I use 4-ply yarn. So I made socks for him before, which I knew he liked, but I never really made any effort to, I'm going to really, give my brother a bunch of socks. Until this past September, when I went to Michigan to visit my mother, and my brother lives just a couple hour drive from my mother in Michigan, and so he came up for the weekend, and he brought me a nose to pin. He's a woodworker, so he brought me a nose to pin for hand winding balls of yarn he had made for me, and I was really happy with it. And all, for the 6 months, up to that time, I'd been really working on figuring out good ways, like a systematic way of making short row heels and peasant heels fit, like how to modify them in a systematic way rather than the sort of vague way people tend to tell you to modify them. Because the women in my family, we all have skinny ankles, very tall heels, very high arches. So we have a very long heel diagonal. So I've always knit heel flap and gusset socks for all of us. And I never really spent much time working on short row heels or peasant heels. Well, in September, I was doing a whole series on these, making modifications for him. And because my brother's foot is such a different sort of proportion, or it's on a different scale than mine, I wanted to measure his heel diagonal and see if I had this whole spreadsheet that could take into account gauge and these measurements and then spit out the actual way to do this. And I just wanted to see if it would work still with his measurements. So he pulled his sock off so I could measure his foot, and his leg had all these like red marks in them from where his sock had been around his leg. And it was a store-bought sock. And I said something about, geez. And he's like, yeah, the socks that you knit for me don't do that. But store-bought socks, they only come in one size, one circumference. So that's what they do to my legs. So that was, first of all, he gave me a nose to pin it, and secondly, he needs my socks. So that changed everything. So I went out and I bought a bunch of 6-ply Regia yarn, and this is the first pair of socks. Now, I never sent them to him yet. I haven't woven in the ends. And his birthday's later this month. So as soon as these dry, I'll be mailing them off to him. Now, I did a peasant heel for him. And I really like the peasant heel. I have a way of doing the decreases on the side that I like a lot better than if you do it like a regular toe, where you get the kind of wider band at the top. So I do decreases that are aimed at each other side by side, rather than having two between each other and having them facing away. So I just like the way that looks. So the other pair of socks that I knit, I think I started back in April, when I was really starting to get into this whole short row heel, peasant heel thought process. So because what I wanted to do was to knit a sock where the striping pattern was uninterrupted all the way down. So I didn't want to interrupt it at the heel for the short row, or with a gusset, heel falcon gusset, which interrupts it and then makes the size of the stripes different. So for this short row heel, I did some increases, a little tiny gusset before I started the heel, and then I did a gusset afterwards, because I have to have a lot more stitches in order to get a heel that's long enough so that the heel diagonal fits me. So I used some yarn I had in my stash for the heel, which I think it works pretty well with this turquoise stripe here. It's not perfect, but close enough. And I can always tell people I'm colorblind. So that's what I've done so far. So I've knocked 3 things off. So now I'm actually back down to the 14 that I started with. So that's my update on my projects. So now I want to give some tips or suggestions for how to approach reducing your UFO pile, whether or not you are committing to the month of February being finished at February, because there are really a number of ways you can approach that UFO pile reduction. And I think it helps to understand, to look at it with an understanding of what kind of a knitter you are and what kind of enjoyment you get out, like what is it that you get out of knitting? Because understanding what motivates you to knit, I think it helps when you're trying to tackle a UFO pile. So a lot of times people talk about product knitter versus process knitter. And I think somebody even made a comment last week about, oh, that's definitely a process knitter thing, having all those UFOs. And I was agreeing with her, because I do, I have thought about myself as being a process knitter. And then I really started thinking about it. And I think that my UFO pile reflects process projects, but don't necessarily reflect the entirety of my knitting personality. So like my basic personality is I'm an information seeker, and then after that an information sharer, which is why I like to teach. And so process knitting, where I'm just trying things and experimenting, and the whole master knitter thing, that's all about learning and trying to understand more and just getting more information. So a lot of those projects do end up in the bin because there wasn't a purpose to them, or I didn't care about the product. But I finish a lot of projects, hundreds and thousands probably by this point of projects. So I realize I have different motivations when I start a project. Now, I always start a project with enthusiasm. I can't wait to get the new stitch pattern and the project and the yarn combination, and I have a lot of enthusiasm that will carry me through to the end of a small project that doesn't take weeks and weeks and weeks. So my enthusiasm for starting can carry me through. But also, when I'm knitting a gift, it is about the product, because the product represents, it's a tangible expression of my love for the recipient, because I only knit for people I love, with the exception of unborn babies, because I love to knit little tiny baby things because they're adorable, and you can put any kind of a hat on a baby and it's just funny. So But I don't knit for people I don't really know. And so I have this different motivation when I'm knitting a gift that I have when I'm knitting something for myself. Because a lot of times when I'm knitting for myself isn't really something I want, it's just something I want to do. So when I do finish some of these UFOs, sometimes I'm like, well, now what am I going to do with it? You know, throw it in a bin, or try to figure out if there's a time I can give it to somebody as a gift in the future. So, but my first year of knitting, I was learning a ton. It was both process and product, sort of equal. You know, it's like, what, you know, I learned to knit because I wanted to make myself that top. So I learned how to knit so I could make that. And that was really, really fun. And I really liked seeing that I could get to the end of it. So then I wanted to knit a little cardigan for my nephew, and I learned how to do sleeves and a button band and a little stitch pattern. And then I wanted to learn how to do collar work, and then I wanted to learn how to do cables. So every project I was learning, that whole first year, I was like learning. And I was getting these products, and a lot of them were gifts that I could then give to somebody. So it was really pretty equal that first year when I was learning so much and producing one thing after another. But then after the end of that first year, I was basically coasting, and I coasted on what I had learned that first year for about 18 more years, or about 13 more years, and then I had a 5-year knitting hiatus. But in a lot of those years, I didn't knit very much. I might go the whole year and realize it was mid-December. Geez, I haven't knit anything. I'm going to quick knit something for my niece or my nephew or something before the end of the year so I can keep my record going. But then I hit a period where I was doing a lot of writing. And so I was learning a lot about writing, and the knitting kind of went to the side. And then I saw Lily Chin on Nitty Gritty knitting something with beads. And that was something I had never done before. And I had an event like 4 or 5 months into the future where I was going to a very fancy event, and I knew it was going to be air conditioned, it was going to be freezing cold inside, and that I would want a wrap. And I thought, oh, I'm going to knit a beaded wrap. So I went down to my yarn shop that had been my yarn shop for years and years and years, but I hadn't stepped foot in for 5 years. I stepped in there, and the owner's like, hi, Roxanne. She remembered me. And she showed me a shawl pattern. And so she showed me, and this is something she had designed. It had been an interweave knits a couple of years before that. But it's this beaded linen shawl. It has like a little bit of a lace pattern. And I think there are 10,000 beads in it. So the pattern was pretty simple, but using the beads was a new thing for me. So, and that was when it was by going back to the yarn shop that I found out about knitting, and I started finding out what in the 5 years I'd been gone, there were all these knitting blogs, and there were knitting groups I could find out about, and I could meet real knitters in real life. I had never known any other knitters in real life before. And I found out about the Master Hand Knitting Program. So there's all this incoming of new information that I was really excited about. And I was knitting along this thing with the beads. And I hit a point where I thought, I do not have the discipline or fortitude to complete this thing. And I really want it. So, there were all these new things. I wanted to learn how to knit socks. I wanted to do this. And I was, getting so engaged in all these things I wanted to learn. And I had learned how to use the beads when I was, this far into it. And that can be the point in a project, these rectangular projects, where I feel like I'm in this never-ending hallway of knitting. And no matter how much I'm knitting on it, it doesn't feel like I'm making any progress. So mostly, and I was throwing myself into knitting because I was having trouble with my writing. I couldn't finish a novel, and I didn't want to feel like I couldn't even finish this knitting project. I wanted to finish it. So I figured out, well, how many more inches did I have to go, or how many rows were left in the project, and how many days or weeks did I have left before I was going to this event. And so I figured out that I needed to do like 4 rows a day, or 28 rows a week, something like that, in order to complete it. Well, that gave me plenty of time to work on other stuff. So I realized that I could manage 2 things at one time, because I'd never done 2 projects at one time. I'd only just worked on one until I got sick of it and basically abandoned it forever. Or I just completed one and then did the next one, then did the next one. Or I waited a year before I did another one. So that taught me one thing. And then as I've been looking at all these UFOs, I realized that this sweater, I did a similar thing where I could anticipate a problem I was going to have completing it. So let me show you the back of the sweater. So the back of the sweater, it's a lot of intarsia. There's 6 colors, and these flowers each have about 4, plus there's the background color. So on the back of that sweater, there were 30, maybe 40 color changes in a row at some points. So that was something that took a lot of focus. I would take my knitting projects to work with me, and I would eat my lunch in the lunchroom, and my coworkers would be there, and then I would knit while I talked to them. But this particular project took a lot of focus. Like, that's a lot of color changes to keep track of. I had to have so much focus on what I was doing. So I realized at some point there's so many ends, and there's no way, if I wait until the end of the sweater, I'll never weave in all of those ends. I won't do it. So what I realized, though, was that I could take my sweater to work, and I could sit there and enjoy talking to my coworkers and do this sort of mindless drudgery work of weaving in ends. And it just did a little bit every day. And then that night I would go home and I'd knit some more. And then the next day I would weave in some ends, and, back and forth. So I was enjoying what I was doing while I was weaving in those ends. So because I was enjoying the conversation. So that's something that I like to keep in mind when I have a real slog of a project where I really do want the end result, but it just seems like I'll go insane if I just only work on that thing. So when I have that kind of a project, I'll work it in parallel with another one, and I'll just make a certain commitment to like one ball of the year. Like if I have an Afghan where I'm 10 balls into it, and then I realize, oh, there's 20 more left, I'll give myself 20 weeks to finish it. And every Saturday I'll put in a Netflix movie and I'll knit through that ball of yarn, and then I'll have my allotment for the week done, and then I can work on whatever else I want to work on instead. So that's one of the things that I think has really helped me when the knitting seems a little unpleasant, is make sure I'm doing something fun while I'm knitting it. So the knitting part of it, or the weaving in the ends, isn't as unpleasant as it seems like it's going to be. So this whole product knitter, process knitter, when I look at that first year and I saw how equal it is, I realized that it was that when I came back to knitting, the process part of it really kicked into for me. So I had never done any swatching before. I got to be where I really like to swatch, and sometimes that is like pure process knitting. You're not knitting anything. You're just knitting to see what's going to happen. So that is really the most process of all process knitting. But again, I feel like a given project I have different motivations for starting different kinds of projects. And so if a project is process oriented, when I'm looking at it in my UFOs, that's why I can often say, meh, I'm never going to finish that, because I wanted to see if this would work, and I see that it would work, but I don't really care about having the product. So that's why I can sort of part with things that way. So another thing is, if you just have just a ton of UFOs and you're feeling overwhelmed by that, is to kind of do a big picture. So if you want to reduce your UFO pile, but you're not doing like a time commitment, like I don't care about spending all of February, I just want to reduce my pile. what I do is look at it as a goal of not increasing the UFO pile. And so I really like starting new projects, but if I'm feeling bad about starting a new project because of how many I have unfinished, I think about, well, what would make me feel better about starting something new? And so one thing would be, okay, I'll finish the two easiest things. Maybe I just have to weave a couple ends in a couple different projects, and that will reduce the pile right there. And then I'll let myself do something new that isn't going to end up in the UFO pile. And it's not going to end up in the UFO pile because I really want the product, or it's because it's a gift, or because my initial enthusiasm for starting is going to carry me through because it's small enough, like it's a hat or a pair of mittens or something like that. So I have to know myself well enough to know what are the kinds of things that will carry me through. And then I'll feel good about starting something that I have finished right away too. So then that makes me feel better. And then I can maybe tackle another UFO. And I keep doing that back and forth to make sure that the pile is never getting bigger, and that at least some of the time it's getting smaller until it gets small enough that I'm feeling comfortable again, and I don't feel like I have something hanging over my head. The other thing I do is I get a big picture of the entirety of everything, like how many socks, how many sweaters, how many mittens, how many, and I look at categories and I kind of evaluate what has to be done with each thing and sort of how big is that. And does it seem like a lot? And is it something I can break down into smaller pieces so that, again, I can see my progress? Oh, I got that little sub project done. I got the sleeve done. I got that, mark that off. And now I can go do this other thing. So like in 2016, I had two blanket projects that I was working on. One was a wedding gift for my niece. And the other was a blanket I had started in 2006. The Lizard Ridge blanket, and I just wanted to do it because it looked like fun. So that was totally process, and the gift for my niece was totally about product, because when she said she wanted a blanket, I was like, oh no. So I made a lot of rules about her blanket I was going to knit for her. One was that I knew that when I get about a third of the way into the blanket, that's about when it starts to get unwieldy for me, and when I lose interest and I'm like, ugh. But I also know I have a 3-week tolerance for how long I can knit on one thing at a time. So when we designed her blanket, and it had to be an interesting enough stitch pattern that would be simple, but it would be compelling enough. So I decided to use sequence knitting stitch patterns. So that was mindless but interesting. I knit the blanket into thirds. So I knew that a third of a blanket is manageable in terms of size-wise for me. So I designed it so that there were 3 sections and that they would be joined at the end. It would be joined using a 3-needle I-cord bind off, and then I-cord border all the way around. So it wouldn't get really unwieldy until the very end when I was doing the finishing. So I had and then each section would be something that would be able to be completed in 3 weeks. So I designed that blanket having 30 years of knitting experience, knowing what was a problem for me. And I was able to complete that blanket totally on schedule with no problem, no ill feelings about it. Really liked the result. So then the other blanket I had was this Lizard Ridge blanket that was completely about the process. I knit 1 square in 2006, and then in 2011, I'm like, oh, I really should work on this, and I knit the first one. I'm like, oh, this is so fun, and I'm going to just go through all of these, and I knit 7 of them, and then that was it for 5 years. So in 2016, when I had these like 38, 40 projects, whatever, I divided up Lizard Ridge into a bunch of sub-projects. So each square was a different sub-project. So it sounds like, oh no, now I had 50 or whatever, 55 unfinished projects. But what it did was it allowed me to mix each square, which only took a couple hours, and it used a different kind of Kurion yarn every time. So it was fun to knit those little squares. but I could knit them in between other things. So I was constantly doing something new. So I had, I wonder what this Noro Korean yarn is going to do when I knit it into the square. Now I'm going to knit a sock. Now I'm going to do a cowl. Now I'm going to knit a sleeve of a sweater. Now I'm going to do 2 Lizard Ridge blanket squares. So I was constantly making progress. Things may not have gotten finished yet, but I was making progress on my sub-projects. So by the end of 2016, I did get every one of those squares completed. And now this year, I have little projects. One of them is the seaming is a project, and then the border is another sub-project. So even though I have 17 projects, there are sub-projects for some of them as well, because that's something that helps me see my progress, that I am making progress, and helps me feel like I've got this under control. So again, the main thing for me, because I do love variety, I love starting projects, I have time, I have like limits to how long I can work on something without having to put it to one side or having to introduce another project, that I always try to remember that I'm trying to keep it fun, because I love to knit and I want tackling my pile of UFOs to be just as much fun as starting something brand new. And so I always keep that in mind. What is it that's going to make this fun? And if I can't find anything fun around it, like I'm not even going to watch a fun movie while I'm doing the thing that's not fun, maybe I don't really want to finish it, and maybe it's not worth finishing. So, and I don't tend to look at the knitting I've done as a waste of time, like that I've lost, I can't rip this out because all my work is gone. For me, it's like, why would I waste time I haven't spent yet? Why would I decide to spend time on something that I know I don't care about? That time I've spent knitting is already gone. I can't get it back. So what am I going to do going forward? Now, I will say, I don't just rip things out if I don't have a plan for them, because sometimes I may decide at some point, well, maybe you really do want to finish it. So, so that's how that one bag ended up on the shelf, was that I wasn't going to rip it out yet until I'm ready to actually go forward. And that's another thing where when I run into a project where I made a boneheaded mistake and I'm going to have to rip out in order to continue, sometimes it gets a timeout, and sometimes if it's that I have to start over, I don't rip it out. I get a new ball of yarn and I start it over with the new yarn, and I go forward until I'm out of new balls of yarn, and often I'm past the point where I was in the original piece, so that I can feel better about ripping that one out. Because sometimes it can just be soul crushing to want something and feel like you've got this far and then it's all gone. So I keep that until I need that yarn, then I'll rip it out. So that's another trick that I use. So I hope some of this may have been helpful or interesting to you, and I can't wait to see you next week and show you what I finished then. Thanks for watching.